So let's talk some more about groundwater flow, and more specifically, what conditions might lead us to see it flowing out of areas of the ground. So once again, in general, if we just have, let's say, a porous permeable layer here, like a big piece of sandstone, what we would typically expect to see is that the water would enter the ground through the unsaturated zone. It would enter into the saturated zone or the water table. And then once it's in the water table, it's kind of filled up to this blue line here. But it doesn't usually intersect the surface of the ground. The only place that tends to happen is underneath streams. So in general, we don't see a lot of groundwater exiting the ground, except at the base of a stream. Of course, we would not be able to see that at the bottom of the stream channel. But sometimes if we have different geometries in here, that we can see that happening. So in this example here, we still have our aquifer, our main water table, which is down at the ground here, or down in blue here. It's still intersecting the base of the stream, so it would be feeding into this stream. But now we also have this layer here of impermeable rocks. So this might be, instead of a layer of sandstone, this could be a layer of shale where there's no space between the mud grains for the water to move through. So as the water percolates through the ground and through the unsaturated zone shown in tan here, it reaches this aquitard. That's what we call this impermeable layer, an aquitard. It retards the flow of water. And the water just kind of piles up on top of that aquitard. We would call this type of aquifer a perched water table. So it's kind of perched like a bird on a perch. It's sitting above the main water table and is kind of on this long linear thing here. If this occurs, the water cannot flow through the aquitard. It can flow over the edge and down on this side here, but oftentimes the easier route is to flow out to where that underlying aquitard or impermeable layer would outcrop along the side of this valley here. And if that occurs, then the water is flowing out right on top of that aquitard or impermeable layer, and it's creating something that we call springs. So springs are area where the water is just coming out of the ground naturally, often due to an aquitard. And it has to do with a perched water table sitting above the main water table, or sometimes I will call that the regional water table here. So in this example here, we have the main water table down here, and then we have a perched water table here sitting on top of this impermeable layer. This is also an impermeable layer down here, right? It's called a shale. They call it an aquiclude. It's more often called an aquitard, but we can just refer to it as an impermeable layer. So let's look at an example like here, and I would call this like a local example. Maybe this impermeable layer doesn't extend for miles and miles, but it's just kind of a localized thing. In that sort of case, we could get something like this, where we have a sandstone on top here, a shale here, and the water is underneath the ground behind this outcrop. It's seeping down, it's hitting this aquitard here, and it's just kind of seeping out the front. We would consider this a spring, even though the water is not gushing out of the ground. We have groundwater coming out of the ground due to this geometry, so we would call that a spring. And sometimes we can have more of a volume of water doing that. In this example here, this is, if we have a main water table, a much more regional water table that also has an aquitard below it or an impermeable layer, then we would just have a much larger volume of water coming out of the ground. Is the Mini Miller Springs, which are along the Snake River in Idaho. And here we can see where that layer is in the ground. It's where all of this flow begins. And the water is coming out from groundwater to surface water, but it's not very channelized in this area just because it has such a large amount of groundwater that is distributing all at once. So just a example of a much more regional aquifer that is hitting an aquitard or an impermeable layer and coming out of the ground along one linear feature here, which is where those two layers of the rocks intersect. One thing to remember about these perched water tables is there's not a large volume of groundwater associated with it. So even though this person dug a successful well there, and they don't have to pump very hard to get the water because it's much higher than the main water table or the regional aquifer in this area, that volume of water is not going to last for a very long time. So even though they dug a unsuccessful well deeper and did not encounter any water because they were still in the unsaturated zone, in the end, it might be better for them to extend this well or extend this well down into the main water table and the regional aquifer, because there would be a much larger volume of water that they can pump.